part of our ongoing lecture series, tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Travers. So Ann Travers is a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University. Their recent book, The Transgeneration, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. It situates trans kids in Canada and the US, white settler nations who are characterized by significant social inequality. And is also a principal investigator on a SSHRC Insight Grant titled Gender Vectors of the GVA, that's the Greater Vancouver Area, thank you, using video game technology to assess social safety nets for transgender and gender nonconforming children and youth in the Lower Mainland. And we'll talk tonight about transgender kids and social inequality, situating social movements within white supremacy, colonialism, and enforced poverty. Please join me in welcoming Ann Travers.
Thanks, Aaron, so much for such a great introduction. It's an incredible honor to be here and to be delivering a Lansdowne Lecture, as well as to be involved in any way with the chair in transgender studies at UVic. It's such an impressive organizational triumph, shall I say, and it makes me sad that my own university doesn't have something similar, because it obviously creates a lot of vitality on campus and certainly vitality in the scholarly world. I want to thank all of you for braving the elements tonight. I grew up in Toronto, so this is not that big a deal, but it's amazing. I was thinking, oh, it's slippy. I've been in Vancouver since 1984, so I've adapted, but I appreciate you making the extra effort to come out tonight. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am an uninvited guest on the unceded territories of the, if I pronounce it incorrectly, forgive me, Lekwungen and Saanich nations, and a white settler who lives and works on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam First Nations. Part of my responsibility as an uninvited guest and as a scholar involves resisting the colonial erasure of Indigenous peoples and their rightful claims to the land. And in my work with regard to trans kids and LGBT people more broadly, it's something that I always keep in mind. I identify as trans non-binary. For the past 8 years, I've been attending conferences and meetings for trans kids and their families in Canada and the United States, conducting interviews, participating in online groups, and publicly advocating for queer and trans kids, as well as LGBT people in general. The main result of this is the publication of my book, The Transgeneration. Trans kids are present in every population, whether they make themselves known or not. Educational scholar Mark Helen observes that the majority of trans kids are in fact non-apparent, meaning they hide because they know they won't be accepted. This is the self-perpetuating logic of the Thomas theorem, whereby situations that are defined as real become real in their consequences. Ultimately, both visible and invisible trans kids are vulnerable to high-risk behavior, self-harm, and suicide, not because they are transgender, but because of the cultural and social prejudice that does so much damage. Trans kids represent normal and healthy gender variation, and they're not new, as Jules Gill-Peterson documents in her recent book, Histories of the Transgender Child. I should know, I was one of them. It's crucial to situate trans kids within broader relations of power and oppression. Canada and the United States are huge, varied, and contested nations on geographical spaces that have mostly been obtained illegally. They brand themselves as democracies, but each is more accurately understood as a white settler nation, albeit with different histories of displacing and committing genocide against Indigenous populations and subjugating racialized minorities. These histories provide a crucial genealogy of contemporary socioeconomic inequality and the contexts within which we find trans kids. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 trans kids in particular: Hunter, Ren, and Finn, pseudonyms obviously, to emphasize the importance of paying attention to ways that varying degrees of social inequality shape the life chances of trans kids. I will then discuss problems with mainstream approaches to supporting trans kids and conclude by outlining key aspects of an anti-oppression approach. When Hunter was attending a special education program for kids who are learning disabled in his school district, he described announcing to his class one morning that he was transgender and having his teachers respond by calling his mother to ask, quote, if she was accepting this. And of course she said, I wouldn't be sending my kid to the school dressed like this or saying a different name if I wasn't accepting it. But they called her at least 3 or 4 times, like farther apart, and just kept asking the same question. But they would never say anything straight to my face. Hunter was understandably angry that they didn't take his word for it. But the multiple calls to his mother speak to another troubling dynamic. Hunter's mother is poor, indigenous, and a single parent, all of which make her particularly vulnerable to state surveillance, oversight, and child apprehension. The adults at Hunter's school responded to his transition by questioning his authority and that of his mother is consistent with the pervasive assumption that children lack knowledge about and authority over themselves, and the Canadian assumption that Indigenous parents don't know what's best for their children. When I first interviewed Ren, she was 7, and she told me, I was born a boy, but I like being a girl. The hostility to children who are assigned male at birth but express feminine qualities is keenly felt by kids like Ren. Ren actually just wishes she had been left alone and not forced to identify as any gender. But she switched to female pronouns when she was 7 because the gender confusion she provoked in other people and their insistence on making it her problem was too anxiety-producing for her. When I asked Ren about her vision of herself in the future, she was completely matter-of-fact in explaining that she did not see herself becoming a transgender woman. She didn't see that as an option. She told me of her plan to change back into a boy when she turned 10. I never doubt anyone's assertions about their gender identity, but I was a bit surprised to hear this, given how stereotypically feminine she is. When I interviewed her again at age 11, her timeline for changing back had shifted, but the vision of her future had not. She was operating in stealth mode at a new school and now planned to change back into a boy at 14 or 15. Ren consistently refuses the possibility of trans adulthood for herself, explaining, I'm black, I don't want to be trans too. In seeing no future for herself, literally, Ren displays a sophisticated and heartbreaking understanding of the harmful effects of trans negativity and anti-black racism. Finn also saw no future for himself and ended his life. Brace yourselves, this is a tough story to hear. 2 years ago, I learned, via his mother's heartbreaking announcement in an online group for parents of trans kids, that Finn had committed suicide. I obtained permission from his mother, Heidi, to share some of what she wrote in her post to the group. It's been 5 weeks since my 14-year-old transgender son, Finn, took his life. We had a discussion that night at dinner about his next hormone blocker shot and how we were going to pay for it, since we'd just gotten a letter that day about our second denial from state insurance and had been told by the drug's owner company that we were slightly over income for their patient assistance program. We couldn't afford the $1,400 out-of-pocket payment a month. He begged me to do a GoFundMe for him, but I told him we couldn't do it for something ongoing. He left the table upset. Oh, how I wish I would have checked in on him. But he spent most of his time holed up in his room, and I was trying to be respectful by not intruding. Later that night, while I slept in the next room, he quietly left the house and walked to the railroad a few blocks away and lay his body across the track. It was the 11 o'clock train. Finn found puberty too difficult to bear and, faced with what he saw as limited options for the future, chose death, This was not a suicide attempt. This wasn't a call for help. This was a really grim and determined choice that, given the options, I'm out. His mother agreed, saying, "I was struck by the mere determination and courage it must have taken to stay on those rails as the train roared down towards him." Heidi described Finn as gifted and wise, but lacking the maturity to manage his considerable emotional sensitivity, saying, "He had to lay down that load he was carrying somehow. The hopelessness he felt in the road ahead of him is what broke him that night. Even if he had no problem getting hormone blockers, he still had his internal demons. But if the barriers to taking the drug weren't there, I don't think he would have died that night." Like many trans kids, being trans is only one dimension of vulnerability for Hunter, Ren, and Finn. But lack of family support is not one of them. They all had it. Family acceptance is known to be the most significant factor shaping mental health outcomes for trans kids. But the socioeconomic status of their families is key to their life chances. Activist parents of trans kids have been one of the driving forces behind the emergence of support networks for kids and families, legal and policy changes, and increasing access to affirming healthcare. Most of the parent advocacy on behalf of trans kids in Canada and the US is engaged in by well-educated white mothers, many of whom at least appear to be heterosexual. Given the gendered nature of emotional labor in general in Western societies, it's not surprising that the frontline fight has been led by women, most of whom are able to call on a degree of race and class privilege and/or the cultural capital that comes from experience engaging in other social justice struggles. Political scientist and parent of a trans kid, Kimberly Manning, explains this tendency by pointing out that more marginalized families are also struggling under the harmful effects of racism and/or poverty, and the disadvantage their trans kids experience is not confined to gender identity. However radical the more mainstream appearing activist moms of trans kids may actually be, their ability to project as non-threatening and motherly enables them to intervene on behalf of queer and trans kids in uniquely powerful ways. Trans and queer adults have certainly played a major role in pushing schools to be more LGBT inclusive, but the power of these so-called normal moms to challenge schools and other institutions to change the way they do gender and sexuality can't be overstated. Sometimes, however, the challenges faced by trans kids from marginalized families can be overlooked in this process because their parents face more barriers in advocating for them. Manning observes that, quote, "under the glare of the media spotlight, personal testimonials can contribute to the erasure of some trans lives, for example, and of the racialized transgender kids who are at far greater risk of violence than our own white children." Kai, a parent of a trans kid and an LGBT youth worker, addressed this reality by asking, how do we protect young people who don't have privileged activists as parents? I contend that we need to center more precarious trans kids in our scholarship and social change efforts. I begin building this argument by focusing on the shortcomings of mainstream trans rights initiatives that center more privileged queer and trans people. I began writing my book in 2015 amid unprecedented and yet far from mainstream support for lesbian, gay, and transgender rights in Canada and the United States. LGBT activism at that point had been successful in achieving significant changes in legal and policy landscapes for LGBT people of all ages, although more uniformly in Canada than in the United States. There are now consequences for discriminating against queer and trans people in many jurisdictions and institutions. Canada legalized same-sex marriage in 2005. Bill C-16 became law on February 14, 2017. Bill C-16 amended the Canadian Human Rights Act to include gender identity as a prohibited ground for discrimination, and the Criminal Code to make transgender people an identifiable group protected by hate speech provisions. Though many Canadians appear to feel smugly superior about Canadian inclusiveness, viewing racism and intolerance as an American, or lately British, rather than a Canadian problem, colonial, racist, and heteropatriarchal patterns of oppression persist as foundational components of Canadian institutions and culture. While Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton declared that gay rights are human rights in 2011. State bans on same-sex marriage were ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013. On May 9, 2016, then U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced that the federal government was taking the North Carolina state legislature to court over HB 2, its controversial law requiring transgender people to use the bathroom corresponding to their assigned birth sex. The Obama administration followed this statement on May 13, 2016, by sending a letter to every school district in the U.S. directing them to allow transgender students to use the bathroom appropriate to their self-defined gender identity. This letter clearly communicated the then federal government's intention to include gender identity as a protected category under the gender equity provisions of Title IX. I don't need to tell you that the 2016 U.S. presidential election resulted in a dramatically different political landscape for vulnerable people, LGBT people among them, and trans kids there too. In the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, executive orders radically deepened forces of precarity for Muslim people, racialized migrants, and undocumented people, people of color in general, Jews, refugees, the poor, indigenous people, people with disabilities, women, and queer and trans people. Trump specifically targeted trans kids for persecution on February 22, 2017, when he announced that he was revoking the directive by the Obama administration to interpret gender equity provisions in Title IX to allow trans students to use bathrooms and locker rooms consistent with their gender identities. The Trump administration has reversed a number of pro-LGBT decisions of the Obama administration, including, most recently, the right of transgender people to serve openly in the military. While trans rights have been enshrined at the federal level in Canada and in all but 2 provinces, the current hateful shift in the political landscape of the United States, the election of right-wing governments in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, and ongoing anti-SOGI movements continue to negatively impact the life chances of trans kids. But mainstream LGBT campaigns tend to focus on gender and sexual identity in isolation from other dynamics of oppression. And this is a problem because queer and trans people are not all white and financially secure. The impact of colonialism, racism, and/or poverty makes some trans kids more vulnerable than others. As we approach the 2020 U.S. presidential election, perhaps you, like me, are filled with equal parts hope and fear, possibly despair. But know this, the election of Hillary Clinton would have perpetuated violence against racialized and undocumented people within U.S. borders and people living in sites subject to U.S. military aggression. Migrant children were separated from their families by U.S. border agents under the Obama administration. This is not a new atrocity. I'm reminded here of a photograph of a protest sign that circulated on Twitter. It was a presumably middle-class white woman holding a sign that said, "If Hillary won, we'd be having brunch right now." This message defines political success for many people who don't experience abandonment and violence at the hands of the market or the state. Dan Savage's It Gets Better campaign, initiated in response to the highly public suicides of gay teens, for example, has been criticized for only speaking to those LGBT kids who are otherwise privileged. It fails to acknowledge that for many visible minority and poor LGBT young people, it doesn't get better. As they grow to adulthood, they remain dogged by discrimination and poverty, continue to be vulnerable to self-harm and suicide, are especially likely to be unable to access health care, and are disproportionately at risk of spending time in prison. LGBT scholars and activists of color and allies draw attention to the ongoing violence of settler colonialism, the prison industrial complex, the national security state and its global military presence, and the neoliberal dismantling of the welfare state, to trouble the historically inaccurate narratives of Western progress and national myths of foundational social justice that Western political leaders like to propagate when they're speaking in support of LGBT people. For example, when then Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced that the federal government was filing a civil rights lawsuit against the state of North Carolina, she invoked the mythical narrative of the US as a justice-seeking country and referenced, quote, the founding ideals that have led this country, haltingly but inexorably, in the direction of fairness, inclusion, and equality for all Americans. Lynch stated that North Carolina's anti-trans bathroom legislation harms innocent Americans. The implication is that harm is deserved by the non-innocent. And if we look at the people who are disproportionately likely to experience this harm, it's people who are racialized, impoverished, incarcerated, disabled, undocumented, street drug addicted, sex workers, and suspected brown terrorists. In an unprecedented statement toward the end of her announcement, Lynch spoke directly and movingly to transgender people on behalf of the Obama administration, saying, no matter how isolated or scared you may feel today, the Department of Justice and the entire Obama administration wants you to know that we see you, we stand with you, and we will do everything we can to protect you going forward. Please know that history is on your side. This country was founded on a promise of equal rights for all, and we have always managed to move closer to that promise, little by little, one day at a time. It may not be easy, but we'll get there together. Although historically inaccurate statements such as these obscure ongoing structures of oppression, they have undeniable cultural power to lessen the vulnerability experienced by trans kids. What would we give to have a US Attorney General speak that way now? Two things are true here. It was definitely better for some trans kids under Obama, but that administration was far from heroic. And things are definitely better for some trans kids under the Trudeau government in Canada than they were under Stephen Harper. But Trudeau's loyalty to big business and resource extraction, and his government's refusal to equitably fund Indigenous children or respect a recent statement by the United Nations insisting that the RCMP be removed from Wet'suwet'en territory, amounts to no meaningful reconciliation or redistribution of wealth and power. Advances in LGBT rights in Canada and the USA have taken place at the same time that we have seen widening social inequality, the expansion of a racialized prison system, ongoing colonial relationships with Indigenous peoples, and severe cutbacks to public education and social services. These contexts continue to disproportionately increase the precarity of trans kids who are impoverished, racialized, Indigenous, disabled, and/or undocumented residents of Canada and the US. Movements that focus on achieving transgender rights and changing government policies rely on legal discourse as a strategic frame and view legal and policy changes as key mechanisms for improving the life chances of transgender people of all ages. These are part of broader LGBT campaigns and typically focus on achieving two key measures. First, the inclusion of gender identity and expression as protected categories in human rights statutes and public policies that recognize these rights by enabling transgender people to access sex-segregated facilities and sex-differentiated activities according to self-defined gender categories. And second, the enactment of hate crime legislation as protection from anti-queer and anti-trans violence. The basic rights that LGBT movements have achieved and that I definitely benefit from include freedom from discrimination and police persecution, marriage rights and/or benefits for same-sex couples, and the right to adopt and retain legal custody of children. On a visceral level, when I stand in the dugout as a coach at a Little League game, Although I definitely experience feelings of gendered otherness quite often, I'm still able to be a coach as an openly queer and gender nonconforming person. That this was not possible in the past, but now is actually a big deal. When I was 16, I never imagined anything like this would be possible. In spite of the way, however, that the attainment of rights has changed the lives of many of us, there's considerable debate among scholars and activists within trans communities about the appropriateness of prioritizing legal rights granted by the state over working collectively to oppose the widespread inequalities maintained and perpetuated by state and corporate power. Much of this debate mirrors that which occurred within lesbian, gay, and queer communities and scholarship in the 90s and early 2000s about the appropriateness of same-sex marriage as a primary goal of social movements. The logic of marriage equality involved gays and lesbians pushing for recognition as fully human, saying, we're just like you are, only we partner with different people of the same sex. Therefore, qualifying us for the rights and responsibilities that go along with full citizenship. Critics argued, however, that this perspective only rehabilitates and reinforces oppressive liberal humanist hierarchies and systems of governance and expands the power of the state while normalizing private familial responsibility for social and economic welfare. In this sense, previously rejected but comparatively privileged white, middle, and upper class, avowedly monogamous lesbian and gay people are folded into life or welcomed into the nation and accorded citizenship. Trans scholar Eric Stanley applies this analysis to trans movements, lamenting the normalizing force of mainstream trans politics. Jasbir Puar observes that, quote, any single axis identity politics is invariably going to coagulate around the most conservative normative construction of that identity, foreclosing the complexities of class, citizenship status, gender, nation, and perhaps most importantly in the context of very recent events, religion. In writing about queer movements, educational scholar Kevin Kumashiro observes that a single issue focus on sexuality risks complying with other oppressions and excluding their own margins to the extent that such movements become just like the mainstream, except with different identities taking center stage. Mainstream LGBT social movements privilege queer and trans people who are white, documented, relatively wealthy, and gender conforming. Radical critiques of these movements emphasize the failure of rights-oriented measures to redistribute wealth and resources more equitably, even as they expand legal and cultural recognition. If the rights framework has such clear limitations, to what extent then does it make sense to pursue rights for trans kids? After all, a certain degree of privilege is required for trans kids to exercise these legal rights, and the beneficiaries are disproportionately white and relatively wealthy kids who have supportive parents. I'm convinced that while rights initiatives have limits, abandoning them would be a terrible mistake. Rights do deliver important measures of harm reduction and can be strategically important in challenging oppressive cultures. Anti-homophobia and trans-inclusive policies that recognize and value gender and sexual diversity by focusing on changing school cultures to be more inclusive, for example, do challenge oppressive aspects of heteropatriarchy and are not irrelevant, or the Christian right would not mobilize so forcefully against them. It's a quick shorthand. Are we doing it right? If the Christian right is mobilizing against you, you're doing something of value. Rights do matter as they shape cultural climates, legitimate experiences of discrimination, and provide avenues for recourse. According to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, studies have shown that LGBTQ students feel safer and more accepted when they know their schools have policies and procedures that explicitly address homophobia. School board policies that entitle students to form gay-straight alliances are also crucial, as they contribute to making schools safer for LGBTQ students, and as recent research has revealed, for non-LGBTQ students as well. They have a positive impact on the entire culture of the school that benefits all the students. In a recent article in The Guardian, Nicola Davis reports that lesbian, gay, and bisexual students feel safer and report better mental health indicators in states where marriage equality has been achieved, as evidenced by a 14% drop in suicide attempts among queer teens in states that have legalized same-sex marriage. Bill C-16 in Canada and pro-trans announcements by the Obama administration signal to trans people of all ages that we matter and that hatred and fear-mongering should not guide policies that concern us. The value of obtaining trans rights and shaping cultural climates for trans kids has been driven home very sharply by the damaging change in tone and coming from the Trump administration, the Ford government in Ontario, and the Kenney government in Alberta. Rights and policy-oriented changes can and do make undeniable improvements in the lives of many trans kids that I know and care deeply about, but these improvements don't typically contribute to greater socioeconomic equality. Punishment-oriented laws and school policies, on the other hand, do far more harm than good. While mainstream LGBT organizations celebrate government policies that classify anti-LGBT violence as a hate crime, a more critical analysis draws our attention to the way this perpetuates structural racism and classism and reinforces the power of the state to enact violence. In a discussion of queer investments in punishment, Sarah Lamble notes that race and class privileged LGBT people support for hate crimes legislation and harsh punishment for offenders means, quote, many LGBT communities now partly measure their citizenship status on whether the state is willing to imprison other people on their behalf. In Canada and the USA, evidence that an offense was motivated by hatred or bias towards a particular group, except women, because, that would make too much sense, even though misogyny drives so much violence against women. But given that women aren't included as a category subject to hate violence, but should somebody commit a crime against people who are in a group covered by hate speech or hate crime provisions, this tends to contribute to a tougher sentence for an individual offender. And often in the case of youth, it plays a role in having them tried as adults, even when they're minors. And this actually individualizes anti-gay and anti-trans violence, and it doesn't protect queer and trans people at all. These measures don't deter people from acts of violence, and they don't touch the structural dynamics of cisnormativity and heteropatriarchy that are really the cause of so much harm. A prison abolitionist framework draws our attention to the fact that the employment of state repression against offenders as a measure for improving the lives of trans people, it doesn't do that, but it also reinforces the power of the state to police and incarcerate. Over the past 30 years, a phenomenal expansion of the US prison industrial complex has dovetailed with massive cuts to public institutions and programs of support for the most economically vulnerable. State and federal governments have a demonstrated record of disproportionately incarcerating Black and Indigenous people of color and poor people, among whom the most vulnerable LGBT people are to be found. According to a 2017 report by the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law, the incarceration of lesbian, gay, bisexual people is 3 times that for the general population in the US. While not rivaling the United States and Russia, the 2 nations with the highest percentages of their population in prison, Canada's prison population is expanding fast and is equally racialized. Indigenous and Black people are disproportionately subject to incarceration. From this perspective, many trans people, kids included, have way more to fear from the state than they have to look forward to with regard to protection. The issues raised by critics of punitive measures are also at play with regard to the adoption of punishment-oriented anti-bullying policies in many school districts. Many school boards have passed anti-bullying and/or anti-homophobia policies that contest what has long been a normalized practice of targeting queer and gender nonconforming children for harassment and abuse. There's no question that official statements that this kind of behavior is inappropriate are an improvement over the long-standing normalization of such violence, and that policies that focus on changing school cultures and protecting vulnerable students are badly needed. Considerable research has demonstrated, however, that punitive responses to bullying fail to protect vulnerable LGBT kids and instead contribute to a school-to-prison pipeline for racialized and disabled children and youth. Social work scholar Amanda Gebhardt draws attention to the role of Canadian schools in placing Indigenous students on a trajectory to prison, whereby, quote, getting into trouble at school is often the first slip into the school-to-prison pipeline. This is a term coined by researchers in the United States who have been making the links between schooling and prison for several decades. The term describes systemic practices in public schooling, such as special education, discipline, and streaming programs that move poor, racialized youth out of school and then place them on a pathway to prison. In the past 2 decades, many school districts in Canada and the US have passed zero-tolerance anti-bullying policies, often in an effort to protect themselves from legal action. Child and youth studies scholars Monique Lacquerite and Zopito Marino cite the 2000 case of Jubran versus North Vancouver School District number 44 in Canada, in which a student took his school district to court because he was subjected to extreme bullying for years. The ruling assigned legal responsibility to the school district for failing to uphold its own student code of conduct. While the case was a victory in the sense that it placed the responsibility for keeping students safe squarely on the school's shoulders, increasing the punishing capacity of schools has very negative consequences for vulnerable kids. Evidence clearly suggests that punitive responses to bullying don't make LGBT kids safer because rather than attending to heteronormative structural factors, they individualize anti-gay and anti-trans aggression and punish troubled kids rather than marshaling appropriate resources on their behalf. In Lacquerite and Marini's analysis of the zero-tolerance policy outlined as part of Ontario's Safe School Act, for example, they observed that the policy, quote, outlines specific punishments for inappropriate behaviors by using suspension and expulsion more often, as well as police involvement and disciplinary measures. They go on to note that as the policy was employed more and more, expulsion and suspension rates rapidly increase, leading to another problem altogether, an increase in dropout rates. Research indicates that Indigenous, Black, immigrant youth of color, and disabled and LGBT kids are disproportionately targeted for discipline practices that push them out of school. Such exclusion is a strong predictor of future precarity, as many of these children do drop out and either remain or become poverty-stricken and are later likely to be incarcerated. As critical childhood studies scholar Lucia Hodson observes, the criminalization of Black children is a major component of their social oppression. Strong-armed anti-bullying policies actually reinforce institutional racism by exposing more kids to criminalization, family intervention, and systems of law enforcement. This is complicated by the fact that bullying and interpersonal violence are often multi-directional. In a 2012 report, the Public Health Agency of Canada Thank you. In a 2012 report, the Public Health Agency of Canada noted that victims tend to have high levels of emotional problems, while young people who bully tend to have the highest levels of behavior problems. According to a recent study, 33% of the students who reported high involvement in bullying or victimization did so as dual participants. That is, they were involved in both. Another study notes that students are often bullied because they are visibly impoverished and often resort to violence as a mechanism of defense. In the context of ongoing cuts to school budgets, policies that respond to student behavioral problems by allowing expulsion are attractive. Educational scholars Therese Quinn and Erica Miners observe that if teaching staff are cut and those remaining are pressured to meet the needs of the same number of students, there's a far greater likelihood of authoritarian systems of discipline. This doesn't benefit any kids, and it's particularly harmful to those who are most vulnerable. While they note that gender and sexual minority kids experience substantial and long-lasting harm in communities and schools, Quinn and Miner see anti-bullying policies as exemplifying, quote, how a carceral state can take up the harm and violence experienced, as well as the desires of communities for systemic change to advance agendas that do little to make communities safer for those who are non-heterosexual and or gender non-conforming. In social change efforts in support of trans kids, we need to avoid two things. First, we need to avoid protecting trans kids by harming other kids. And secondly, our social change efforts cannot center the mostly privileged trans kids who circulate in mainstream and social media. As I emphasized at the outset tonight, trans kids are to be found in every population, whether they make themselves visible or not. No discussion of trans kids in BC in Canada would be complete without talking about children living in poverty and or in government care, among whom the most vulnerable trans kids are to be found. 1 in 5 BC children grow up in poverty, and Indigenous children, children of new immigrants, and visibly racialized children are disproportionately likely to be part of this marginalized 20%. This 1 in 5 statistic also applies to Canada as a whole, wherein 1 in 2 Status First Nations children live in poverty, and 40% of Indigenous children in Canada overall live in poverty, and it's as high as 60% of Indigenous children who live on reserves living in poverty. 2/3 of the 6,500 children in government care in BC are Indigenous, and 45% of the 185 babies under 31 days old taken into care in 2018 were Indigenous. Indigenous kids in BC make up 55% of youth in care, but less than 5% of the general population. In Canada, 52% of children under the age of 14 in care are Indigenous, in spite of constituting only 7.7% of all children. The particularly precarious position of Indigenous children in Canada reflects ongoing colonialism, intergenerational trauma for residential schooling and Indian day schools, and the unwillingness of the federal government to fund Indigenous children to the same level as non-Indigenous children. Indeed, provincial governments will spend more money placing an Indigenous child with a white foster family than it would cost to provide to alleviate the poverty that is often the cause of having to apprehend that child in the first place. So it's not about money. It's important to note as well that a central aspect of colonialism in Canada and the United States has been the forceful imposition of Eurocentric binary gender and heteropatriarchal systems upon Indigenous people. Forces of oppression relating to racism, poverty, and colonialism combine with an imposed binary gender system to impact the life chances of some trans kids more than others. Radical change will require social movements to support all trans kids by building powerful coalitions with other marginalized communities. The trans kids we can see are typically the ones with the most support, but centering social change efforts around these kids will not produce a sufficient increase in life chances for all trans kids. We need to do this the other way around. If we direct our social change efforts at increasing the life chances of the most precarious trans kids, this will incorporate the gender self-determination needs of all trans kids. I view the care work of parenting as protecting the vulnerable by definition. To use a metaphor I loathe for a moment, that of the lifeboat, I want to know, how do we get all the children in the boat? I have never felt a greater sense of purpose than I do as a parent, and I honestly fear how I might respond to a situation in which only a few children could be saved. It's highly likely that I would do anything to make sure that my children get in the boat, that I would do whatever I could to divert scarce resources to them. But the imaginary circumstance of a boat too small to fit everyone is not inevitable. Widespread social inequality results from human action, and we have the capacity to change how things are done. Neither Ren, who is alive, nor Finn, who didn't make it, could see a future for themselves as trans people, and Hunter's situation as Indigenous, living in poverty, learning disabled, and trans negatively impacts his life chances. I don't believe for a second that any of us would deny any of these kids a place in the boat. But making space for them requires us to build a much bigger boat, and to do this, we need to work for social and economic justice for all marginalized children, to support the many vulnerable kids in our midst and the vulnerable adults they will grow up to be. This requires establishing a baseline of security for all, not only by reversing cuts to social services, school budgets, community centers, and health care services, but by recommitting to and radically expanding a welfare state. Crucial components of this model include guaranteed housing and basic income for all, a completely public and not-for-profit model of healthcare, and equitable nation-to-nation relationships with Indigenous people that include concrete reparations for land theft and genocide. Thinking in terms of the most vulnerable trans kid is a powerful orientation for a vision of a more equitable and just future for all of us. As I see it, we have 4 key tasks. First, we need to generate room for all kids to determine their own gender identities within a really wide range of possibilities. Second, we need to transition environments away from the binary gender system while respecting and supporting people for whom binary identity is meaningful. Third, we need to protect trans kids without harming other kids. And fourth, as I keep emphasizing, we need to put the most vulnerable trans kids at the center of our social change efforts by fighting for a radical shift toward intense social and material investment in all children. I find it heartbreaking that Ren sees no future for herself as a Black trans woman, but I see flashes of possibility and resilience in her. When we were talking about the difficulties involved in being different, Ren observed that these same difficulties can be gifts. When I asked her if she thinks being trans is a gift, she said, "I've heard of gifted as in magical, like a mutant. If you're transgender, you are basically kind of like a mutant. Some things are harder for you, but there are things that you can do that are amazing because you're special, like an X-Man." I hope that Ren will someday find a way to claim all of herself. For all I know, she will do this by coming to see herself literally as some kind of an X-Man. But it's not enough for us to hope that she and other trans kids are able to find this space. We have to go beyond hope and build a big enough lifeboat for all of them. Thank you.